There are a few things more disconcerting, at least for me, than getting sick and not being at home when I get sick, especially if I'm on the road. Or, as it's happened to me a couple of times, you're halfway around the world and you get sick. It's a little disconcerting. Some of you may have had the experience with cars, being someplace on vacation, traveling hundreds of miles from home, the car breaks down. It's a little disconcerting because you're not at home. I know when I get sick and I'm not where I think I'm supposed to be, one of the first things I want to do is think about, oh, hey, I really need to see Dr. So-and-so, somebody I'm comfortable with, because I'm in a town or a city or a country where the healthcare is not familiar to me. And you do the same thing with a mechanic. How many of you, when your car breaks down and you're hundreds of miles from home, do just enough for the car to get it back to the valley so that the mechanic that you like is going to fix it? We all do this. This is a very, very, very small way of understanding what it's like to be a refugee. See, what's disconcerting to us, some of these are first world problems, right? What's disconcerting to us, being in an unfamiliar place, an unfamiliar country, an unfamiliar tongue, is at the heart of the story of the birth of Jesus. It is here. You see, things are not the way they always seem. You know, we celebrated Tuesday evening, we celebrated the birth of Jesus. We told ourselves the Christmas story. And in telling ourselves the Christmas story, we even had a nice Mary and a Joseph making things all just kind of cuddly and fuzzy. Thank you, Nellie. It was great, okay? And that's all good. I mean, it brings something real to the event. But it doesn't stay that way. Things seem to be looking up in Bethlehem. Jesus is born. He's born on that night. He's visited by angels. In the book of Matthew, we find a bunch of distant travelers traveling to see this little baby who's been born in Bethlehem, and they're giving him royal gifts. Things are looking up. This small baby, sung about by angels, visited by distant travelers, given expensive royal gifts. And things are not as they seem. You see, there are two kings in this story in Matthew. It's not just this little baby who has been born, who is being worshipped by these distant travelers. No, there's another king. His name is Herod. And Herod is not a nice guy. What we know from history is that Herod is pretty ruthless. He killed hundreds in his lifetime that he thought were threatening his throne, including his wife and 3 of his sons. Not a nice guy. And the common denominator with his ruthlessness was securing his throne. Now, he wasn't a real king. That was kind of an interesting bit of history. He's not quite a fake king, but he's not the real deal. He is a proxy for Caesar in Jerusalem. But he will do anything to secure his throne, to secure his power. And he takes out his wife, he takes out 3 sons because they are a threat. So what do you think he's going to do when these distant travelers show up in Jerusalem and they're talking about a baby who would be king? Born King of the Jews. You know, it's not quite answered by Matthew. It's kind of an interesting question to think about. Did these distant travelers, surely they knew Herod. Did they really think he was going to take kindly? I don't know. But they go to Jerusalem because you see there's two storylines going on here. The same two storylines that have been going on from the very beginning of the Bible. Between the serpent and the promised one who is going to eventually fix the whole thing. Two storylines show up in our passage. See, the distant travelers, they worship the baby, they leave town, and then bad King Herod sets out to destroy and eliminate the competition. Only this isn't an ordinary competition. This has been going on since the garden. And we know it's not simply an ordinary competition for who is going to be king of the Jews. When an angel shows up and warns Joseph in a dream. And this is the second time in this passage that this happens. This same angel has already shown up once when bad things are about to happen. Joseph in chapter 1, he's about to divorce his fiancée because she is with child. He's not the father. So an angel shows up, stops Joseph from divorcing her, saying, no, everything's okay, everything's going to be fine. And now here again, after the child is born, an angel shows up because bad things are about to happen. Angel shows up, and the angel is protecting this little one. Here again, Matthew tells us the very same words, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. You see, this isn't an ordinary competition. This isn't an ordinary baby. God, again, is intervening in time and space and in history. Matthew goes to great length to make sure that we know that Herod is not in charge. That nothing is normal about this little baby. And that God is in control. And He is orchestrating what is happening. And when it comes to the salvation of His people, this is it. When it comes to the salvation of His people, He is going to go to great lengths to make sure that that happens, even in real time, in real space. You know, sometimes we come to these passages and we tend to think, well, you know, God could just snap His finger and save us all. Why doesn't He do that? Well, one of the reasons why is because God became human. He came to identify with us in real time and in real space. So all of these things are happening as real events in real time and real space, and at key moments when salvation is on the line, God intervenes. God stops the train. We know that God is orchestrating the events here because the angel is changing the course of Joseph's life again. We also know that God is orchestrating things because of where He sends them in His intervention. He sends them to Egypt, and that's not an accident. Get up, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to kill him. Egypt. You know, we know from the book of Luke that Mary and Joseph have already been displaced once. You know, they went from Nazareth to Bethlehem because Caesar Augustus had a tax. He wanted to figure out how big the tax rolls were. Now they're being displaced again here in the book of Matthew. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, not Nazareth. And that is by divine intervention. And instead of a nice warm bed, He's put in a dirty, unsanitary feeding trough. Again, not the cozy straw of Tuesday evening. Joseph and Mary this time, though, are not moving because of a census. They are running for their lives. They're running for the life of this child. And they're headed to a nation now. They're headed to a country that is not their own, a tongue that is not their own. The child is now a refugee child. In fact, that word is here. This word flee that shows up that Matthew uses, it's the same word from which we get the word refugee. And there's no way to sugarcoat this because of what Matthew says next. You see, some have suggested, in fact, it showed up again this week if you were reading the news, if you're reading the stuff that goes on the internet, and I try to stay away from that stuff, but it shows up. Some have suggested that Jesus wasn't a refugee because Egypt is, by this time, is a Roman colony. And there was probably a Jewish population living there. He couldn't be, everything is just laid out so that this isn't the... No. Matthew is going to great lengths to show us that Jesus is being displaced and he is headed to Egypt. There's a bigger story going on here than simply a king and an unwanted baby. See, all along the way here, not only has an angel appeared to Joseph twice Matthew has highlighted the fact that Jesus is fulfilling promises made in the Old Testament. He's pulling us back into the Old Testament story. And if we go and read that Old Testament story, what we find is that Egypt isn't exactly a destination. Their destination is not lost on Matthew. Here's what Matthew says about the flight to Egypt and the return. So that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, out of Egypt I called my son. You see, he's quoting an Old Testament prophet we know by the name of Hosea. And Hosea, in his day, for his people, the people he is talking to, he is referencing the biggest event in Israel's history. What we call the Exodus, their flight from Egypt. God rescues them in the middle of the night from their captors, Egypt. Egypt is never a nice place to be in the Old Testament. And time and again, God's people end up in Egypt, and he is rescuing them from Egypt. Egypt is always a place where there are refugees, Israel's refugees. You see, the first time Israel had been there for 400 years. And God rescues them. Egypt's a place where refugees from Israel go, and it's a place from which Israel is rescued again and again. It's not a nice place to be. And Matthew highlights it for us here. If you're in Egypt, you're there because something bad is going on in the Promised Land. And you've been displaced. That's the story of Egypt in the Bible. And something bad is happening in Bethlehem. Herod is hunting down the promised one, the one who is the heir to David's throne. That heir becomes a refugee and he is on his way to Egypt, and behind him is a massacre. Genocide. Herod is trying to wipe out the Messiah. Just like Pharaoh in Egypt had tried to wipe out the Messianic line hundreds of years before by throwing babies into the Nile. Herod kills all the babies 2 years old and under in Bethlehem. And again, Matthew chronicles and continues to chronicle the events through the lens of the Old Testament. Even this massacre. This unspoken horror of Herod. And again, he pulls a passage in the Old Testament that not only speaks to the horror that happens in Israel, but it's a horror that's in the context of exiles and refugees. He pulls from Jeremiah 31 this time. And Jeremiah is speaking to a people who are being carted off by Babylon because of their disobedience. They are leaving Israel. They are leaving the promised land. Here's what he quotes. A voice was heard in Ramah weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be consoled because they are no more. See, Herod and Pharaoh aren't the only ones who are trying to carry out evil against Israel and the Messianic line. Babylon. Babylon shows up, and Babylon begins to cart off the children of Israel and the Israelites out of their homeland, and they spare nobody, including, they don't spare the kids. Kids are caught in the crossfire. And in Ramah, there is a voice crying because the kids are gone. They've been carted off. They've gone missing. They are no more, unaccounted for. They're dead or abandoned or enslaved in the Babylonian conquest. And there is great mourning and weeping in that moment. And Matthew reads this, and he sees the events going on with Jesus, and he sees and hears the same thing happening in Bethlehem. Great mourning and weeping, paying the price. Now, there are all sorts of questions and implications regarding this event and regarding this baby in Bethlehem who is being protected, now on the way to Egypt. We could chase those. We could chase a lot of questions here. There's a lot of ethical questions that people like to bat around this particular passage. But we're not going to do that because I want us to focus on what Matthew wants us to see in this passage. Let's stay right here. Not only does he want God to see, or us to see that God is orchestrating the events, he also wants us to see Jesus as a refugee. He wants us to see Jesus who has nowhere to lay his head. That comes up again in Christ's ministry. You see, Jesus, as we see him in the gospel, is constantly on the move. He is constantly in motion. He is constantly in discomfort. You understand that this is the God of the universe, the Creator, the one who was there at the very beginning of time, making all of this, taking on a human body and coming to live among us. Do you think that's really a great thing for somebody who's God Almighty? That's no fun. You and I both know how life works. How do you think it feels to be the God of the universe in a human body, experiencing all the things that we do? Christ is constantly on the move. This baby, this is just the beginning. A refugee. And why is he a refugee? He's a refugee for his people. The angel, the first time the angel talks to Joseph, says, this baby is going to save his people from their sins. This baby is going to save them from their sins. That's why he's a refugee. In order to save his people from their sins, he is going to identify with them as one of them. God with us. That's also part of that context. Taking on a human body, coming to live among the very men he is sent to redeem. His people. God is orchestrating the events this way so that Jesus is living the life of Israel. Israel past, Israel present. His people past, his people present. He wants us to see that Jesus identifies with us. He identifies with us. Just as Israel came out of Egypt, so too Jesus is coming out of Egypt rescued as the Son who is someday going to rescue his people from their sins. Many years later, this same Son is going to say in a conversation, I have nowhere to lay my head. I'm a foreigner, having come from heaven to walk this world and win for you your salvation. I have come to seek and to save the lost. He's doing this for us, for our salvation from sin. That's how bad off we are. His discomfort, his flight, his refugee status is to rescue us. It's interesting. Those who've been rescued from sin are then called refugees. 1 Peter 2. Peter picks up on this theme. Peter calls the community that he is writing to, community just like the one that's meeting here this morning. He's writing to his group of people, and he says, we're all strangers. We're exiles. We've been called out of darkness and into light. We're refugees. You see, the one who was a refugee makes us all refugees, just like him. Traveling out of darkness and into light. The world is not our home. This isn't what we see, what we can feel, the things that we work for. This is not our destiny. This world is not our final home. We are truly pilgrims in this world. And my goal today here is to stick to the text. We're not going to get political because, again, it'd be very easy for us to sidetrack this whole thing and start talking about refugees. But I do want to interject this. I think one reason why we have a hard time with this whole thing about refugee, and whatever that means to you, whatever that means to me, and whatever political persuasion you're from, I think one reason why we have such a hard time talking about this because we think this world is our home. By nature, me included. I'm constantly grasping and trying to hang on to what I can see here, making this world my home. Working for what I can see today and what will get me further along today. We're way too comfortable. I'm way too comfortable trying to hang on to all of my stuff. And I think Peter's picking that up too, the community he's writing to. Paul does the same thing in Ephesians. He says, we're citizens of another world. Citizens of another place. Roots, yes. Legacy, yes. We've got responsibilities. But don't drive those stakes too deep, because this world is not our home. The things that I think are shiny and really cool, it's all going to burn. It's not going to last. You see, the refugee came to save us from all our stuff. The stuff we can't hang on to. The stuff that will eventually burn. And it's not to say again that all of it's bad, but it's how we approach it. There could be a point in which we're hanging on to it too tightly. And we forget we're refugees, all of us, exiles, moving from darkness to light, called out of darkness into light, belonging to a kingdom that is not of this world. And that's the work of the one who was the refugee on our behalf. You see, he went to Egypt. He came out of Egypt for us, to save us, to make us his people, to usher in a new era, to make it a new day, to bring hope where there is no hope. You see, that passage from Jeremiah that Matthew quoted, we didn't finish. Matthew quoted that passage from Jeremiah, And that passage is not the whole story. He picks from Jeremiah 31 the one verse that is a negative, and it is a very, very negative. It's dark. The voice from Ramah, weeping for children. But the rest of the context of Jeremiah 31 is that weeping is in the context of a new day that is dawning, a new covenant that is coming into existence. God is giving His people a new day, a new heart, a new life. He is giving them forgiveness. Listen to what this says. All that weeping is going to be turned into joy. At one point he says, all of this is going to end up with sweet consolation. Then he says this, I will be their God. They will be my people. I will forgive their iniquity and never again remember their sins. No little ones in flight to Egypt. And yes, there's horrible, horrible genocide in Bethlehem. But in the midst of all this darkness and all the despair and all the hopelessness, Matthew is pointing out the hope. The hope is in that one who is on his way to Egypt. Even for those who are dealing with the suffering in Bethlehem. This baby is the hope, this refugee baby, because you see, he is going to grow up and he is going to die. And he is going to forgive his people all of their sin and remember it no more. May look bleak. It may feel, and it really may be horrific. But this one who has been born is going to forgive you. You understand, he's going to forgive you all of your sins and never remember them. Sins past, sins present, sins future. Forgiven. The mourning in Bethlehem is going to be turned to joy because the promises are being fulfilled in this little one who is born King of the Jews.